Well, the book was written as a way of exploring the relationship between the Bush administration and its controversial foreign policy, most importantly the Iraq War, and the broader issue of how it connects to Wilsonianism and liberal internationalism. To what extent is Bush the heir of Woodrow Wilson?
This was an interesting book to be a part of because it was a book that took a active live debate on a panel and turned it into a much more sustained argument among four scholars in a book. And my contribution did two things. It started by rebutting Tony Smith's attack on neoliberals, as he called them, and I was certainly, in his view, a neoliberal. He attacked the neoliberal enabling of neoconservatism. And in one word, he effectively said that liberal Democrats who favored the use of force had more or less opened the door to the Iraq War, had enabled the entire neoconservative movement. So the first thing that my chapter did was to refute that in no uncertain terms. And the second part of my contribution was to lay out my own vision of what Wilsonianism should look like and what its principles have turned into in the 21st century.
Well, I try to frame the debate, but I also try to make the argument a little bit more complicated by saying that there are several different strands in the Wilsonian and liberal international tradition, that it's not just about democracy. In fact, it's about building order. And order has different components: rule of law, trade and openness, democratic community, partnership, multilateralism, security, cooperation. These are all features that fit together in a kind of liberal order. So if we think of the Bush administration as focusing primarily on use of force to promote democracy in the Middle East, he is not really representing the full tradition in all of its kind of full vision of liberal order.
Bush was not the heir to Wilson. Some of Bush's ideas certainly resonated with Wilson's ideas. Indeed, many of Wilson's ideas have become the larger foreign policy consensus that shapes all American foreign policy. But Woodrow Wilson believed very strongly in multilateralism. Indeed, his presidency crashed on his failure to get the League of Nations approved by the U.S. Senate. So he would never have treated international institutions in the cavalier fashion that the first George W. Bush administration did. He would have thought that the value of what he called common counsel, which is something he looked at in local and state politics and also international politics, was vital to world order. So in that regard, George W. Bush was not Wilson's heir. And similarly, although both Wilson and Bush believed in democracy, Wilson really believed in self-determination. He believed that people should decide their own fate, and we would hope that they would choose a liberal democracy, but if they didn't, he never thought we should go in and invade them and change their government. So at some very abstract level, you could say, yes, George W. Bush subscribed to Wilsonian principles, but the way he thought about implementing those principles, and really the way he even defined those principles, I don't think are things that Wilson would have recognized.
Well, yes and no. I hate to be not giving you a definitive answer, but in many ways, I think as time goes on, we will see that this was a kind of experiment that didn't work, and that it wasn't really about Wilsonianism, because it really wasn't about building a cooperative international order. It was about a very different experiment using American power to organize the world in a kind of unipolar way. There was a great vision of how the U.S. could really run the world, and I think that failed. And we will come back to Wilsonianism and liberal internationalism, but it is really more of a argument about building cooperative institutionalized order. And so it really will be a return, I think, to a more traditional Wilsonian tradition.
I think that Wilsonian values in the 21st century really do have to be understood differently than when Wilson was president. So if you said self-determination today, which was really a rallying cry in World War I, many people, certainly in the street, would say self-determination. What is that? Does that mean Quebec gets to secede from Canada? That's sort of the way people think about it. Today, what it means is that people should be able to choose their own governments. I'd flip that formulation and say the legitimacy of governments rests on their ability to provide for their people in many different forms, but they have to provide basic services that satisfy the basic wants of their people. And if at some point their failure to provide for their people becomes so great as to really amount to an attack on those people, a gross failure to protect, then there is an international responsibility to act. And that's the first way I think Wilsonianism really translates into the world we find ourselves in.
Well, there's going to be a lot of soul-searching and rethinking because we've just been through a traumatic period, and there has to be a process of what have we learned, what doesn't work, what does work. And I think there will be more skepticism of democracy promotion, even if the Bush administration's Iraq war was not really about democracy, it was about something else. But nonetheless, there's a kind of sobered appreciation for the complexities of trying to change societies. This is something America learns over and over, or learns and forgets over and over, because of course Vietnam told us that as well in other cases. But I think there will be a kind of sobered, more cautious view about how the U.S. can use its hard power, but probably a greater appreciation of how important it is to use its soft power, its ideals, its willingness to work through diplomacy.
Part of the heart of the argument between Tony Smith and me really goes to a slippery slope argument. So his argument says, look, you liberal hawks, you neoliberals who believe that there are cases in which it's appropriate to use force. Rwanda, for instance, I certainly would have used force. I supported the use of force in Kosovo. He says, once you open that door to the violation of another country's sovereignty in cases of extreme human rights violations, there's no way to stop. You will then slide down the slope to approving interventions to get rid of a government you don't like. My response is no. There is a legitimate line between cases of severe human rights violations, severe systematic, of genocidal proportions. We can say in those cases the international community can decide to intervene without licensing any government, whether the US government or the Russian government or any other, to simply go in and invade countries at will. And that distinction is a key distinction between the heirs of Wilson, the liberal internationalist multilateralists, and neoconservatives who do believe in human rights and democracy, but who also believe in the military as their primary tool.
Well, Wilsonianism is part of a broader tradition that runs through the 20th century in American foreign policy. Really a tradition across both parties that argues that the U.S. can serve its own interests and the wider world through building institutions, building order around free trade, international law, and making common cause with democracies, and putting the United States really in a position of trying to crystallize a open, rule-based international order. One version of the liberal argument is that the world is better when there are more democracies, and America, with all of its power, should be trying to, both for normative reasons, that it's good to have a world with democracies, but also because if you have democracies, you have partners and peaceful states that are willing to operate within a kind of open, rule-based order. So it's all good, the more the better. For normative reasons and for practical security reasons, therefore it's good to go about trying to help history move forward by pursuing democratic promotion, in this case through the use of force.